Back with your most important NASCAR betting stop of the day. This is the Money Stop with Cole Cusumano. I'm Steven Cusumano. Together, we are the Cusumano brothers, and we welcome you, the Money Stop Mafia, after the money man himself, Young Money, Kyle Larson, punched his ticket into the Championship 4 with an opening round win at Vegas in the round of 8. Cole, he was your pick to win. We have now picked winners in 3 of the last 4 races, and we've gone 4 weeks in a row picking drivers that finished in the top 2. It's a pretty impressive display here on the Money Stop, presented by Kicking the Tires and SharpLink Gaming. We said it last week, when these drivers get to the playoffs, the cream rises to the top, and the drivers that are at their A game, they reach their A game at this point in the playoffs. And here on the Money Stop, we're doing the same thing. We're rising to our A game, our hottest streak of the season as we get to season's end. So impressive display by Kyle Larson, edging out Christopher Bell, but there's a lot of playoff implications coming out of this race. But starting there, Kyle Larson punching himself into the Championship 4.
Yeah, what an exceptional drive by Kyle Larson. And not just him, but the entire 5 team. When this entire 5 team is gelling, there is no more dangerous team in the garage area. And going into a race weekend right now in Homestead, I think that this 5 team is the clear favorites once again. You'll see that heavily shown in the odds going into this race, but just a masterclass by that 5 team and the Money Stop on the Money Stop. And I just think I'm really pumped up for these final 3 races of the season, because as we've seen these last 4, just absolutely killing it on our end, and only 3 more chances to cash out. So stick around.
Yeah, we'll see if we can pick a winner for a 5th consecutive week. But as you mentioned, Cole, it just seems like this time of year, that 5-team Cliff Daniels, they always rise to the occasion and get to their best at this time when the calendar turns to October. We get to near Halloween. We'll go to Homestead. We'll go to Phoenix to crown a champion in a couple of weeks. You and I will both be there. But you were there in Vegas, and it was a really exciting race. But we're going to determine a starting lineup for Homestead Saturday morning, 9:50 a.m. Eastern Time. Before we get to that, Cole and I will give you our best idea of who may be the contenders on the track. And it's all going to start with our odds pre-qualifying per SharpLink Gaming and BetMGM. And as you alluded to, Cole, the overwhelming favorite, Kyle Larson, plus 275 this week. They have nothing to race for. They're just going out for wins. Again, punching their ticket into the Championship 4 where the points will reset. And they have really established themselves as the team to beat at this point. Tyler Reddick and Martin Truex Jr., a couple guys trying to get into the Championship 4, co-favorites for second, plus 600. Denny Hamlin is plus 700, and William Byron rounds out the top 5 in odds at plus 750. They would only be fitting to kick off this favorites category with the overwhelming favorite to win the race. Kyle Larson, last week's winner, $11,500 in daily fantasy is his hefty price, and he is probably worth it because, of course, he was the winner last week. He was also the winner last year in dominating fashion at Homestead. He led 199 laps and swept both stages en route to the Championship 4. That was his only win at this track. 5 top 5s, though, in 9 Cup Series starts at Homestead. 529 laps led in those 9 starts as well in the Cup Series, which is, of course, the most among active drivers. There is a very good reason why Kyle Larson is the overwhelming favorite to win this race, and they have nothing to race for other than a win. So they can go out, play strategy, do whatever they want to do en route to potentially stringing together even more momentum coming out of Vegas and into Homestead. Behind Tim, the other favorite I really like this week, Cole, is a guy that has been one of the top 3 drivers, I would say, all year long, and especially in the playoffs. Denny Hamlin, plus 600 for the win. And at $11,000 in DFS, he is one of the most expensive drivers as well. Coming off a top 10 finish at Vegas. Homestead, though, 3 wins, the most recent of which came in 2020. Almost 400 laps led at this track. An average finish just inside the top 10 over 18 starts, and he finished 7th here last year. And as I just finished touching on, 2 points to the good in the standings, which essentially is no cushion whatsoever. They need to have a good run. Denny's been strong all throughout the playoffs. That's a team that, you think about the drivers that you expect to be in the Championship 4 punching their ticket early, and you would expect that those drivers that have been the cream of the crop all year long will get the job done. I think that will be the case with Denny Hamlin this week. I expect a very, very strong performance from the 11 team.
Yes, very nice. Could not agree more. Both Kyle Larson and Denny Hamlin, the favorites going in, and for a good reason, and the most expensive drivers in DFS for a very good reason. I'm going to go with two drivers who have an equally as good a shot, but are on the lesser end of the DFS spectrum. First, beginning with Tyler Reddick. You mentioned how these dirt racers and the guys that rip the high line really excel at this 1.5 mile track in Miami. Tyler Reddick is definitely in that conversation. Plus 600 for the win, tied with Denny Hamlin at runner-up favorites for this win. 10,700 for DFS, which is still a steep value, but much less than those two drivers you mentioned in Larson and Hamlin. Finished 8th at Vegas last week in what was, I would call, a fairly disappointing showing, in my opinion, just because he was quickest in practice. We expected him to go out there and lead a bunch of laps and really contend for this win. And while he didn't contend, he was still a really strong driver in this race. I think speaking with him on pit road following that 8th place finish, he seemed to be in a much more different headspace than what I've seen from Tyler Reddick in recent memory. Usually you're seeing Tyler Reddick all smiles, just kind of like happy to be there and doing his thing, but it was kind of like all business, and it was kind of, I felt like he knew what he had to do in these next two races. Not that he didn't know that beforehand, but just kind of acclimating to this round of 8 competition. It's his first time in this round. I think he now knows what he has to go out there and do. And I think that'll be a very good thing going into one of his best tracks in Homestead. 2 top 5s, including runner-up here in the Cup Series in 3 starts. Finished 35th here last year, so I do want to touch on the volatility aspect here a little bit. We've seen it with Kyle Larson and Tyler Reddick, and a lot of those dirt guys in the Cup Series when they are first getting going and acclimated to the stock car racing. But he's a driver that loves to run that high line. He excels at it, and we've seen that kind of work in his favor and work against him over the years. But I think you look at this year specifically, we've seen Tyler Reddick take the next step in his career. He's been a front runner the entire season. They've gotten all their inconsistencies ironed out as far as pit road mishaps and whatnot. So I look for Tyler Reddick to really step up to the plate and be a really, really strong contender for this win at Homestead. I don't think that volatility I mentioned is going to be a concern, just seeing as far he's grown in these last couple seasons. And you see that also kind of translate with Kyle Larson as well. He got his first win at Darlington this year. Obviously got the win at Homestead back in 2021. So I think Tyler Reddick's following that same trajectory, and I look for a very same arc, not only in his career, but just at Homestead in general. And I think this is his best shot by far at making the Championship 4. He knows that. So I love Tyler Reddick this week. And then we obviously can't talk favorites without talking William Byron, that other Hendrick Chevy in the playoffs. He is valued at plus 750 for the win, 5th best in the odds, and 10,500 for DFS. And we keep saying this, I think the past 4 weeks of our dominant stretch, he's been the best value in the favorites category by far. He's proven that to be true these past 4 weeks and pretty much the entire season. So I loved William Byron any week, but especially going into Homestead. Coming off a 7th place finish at Vegas where he didn't look very dominant, I would say he was kind of in that same conversation as Tyler Reddick in a sense where they both had nice runs, but not what we were expecting out of them going into this race. And even with that, he still scored his 5th top 10 on 1.5 tracks this season, bringing his average finish to 4.8 between 6 starts. And I think going into Homestead, that's going to be something to keep an eye on, obviously, as we've seen all season with William Byron. But at Homestead, got the win back here in 2021. 134 laps led between his last 2 starts there, and he finished 12th there last year at Homestead. 5-race top 10 streak going in the playoffs with a 5.7 average in these 7 races. Only plus 9 to the good, as you mentioned, at the top. So I think William Byron's a driver like Tyler Reddick, who I'm expecting to think that this is their best shot to clinch their way into the Championship 4. And I think that, looking at how these races have played out, the last 3 or so years at Homestead, it's been Hendrick the past 2, Toyota the 2 prior to that. So you're looking at the Hendrick Chevys and the 2311 and JGR Toyotas as the best picks for the win going into Homestead this weekend.
For sure, and I agree with you that out of those 4 favorites, William Byron's certainly the best value, like we talked about last week. Again, not to sound like a broken record, but just for the people that didn't listen to last week's episode or some of the earlier playoff episodes, last week was one of only 2 times that William Byron did not finish in the top 3 at a 1.5 mile track this year. But again, they've just been so consistent at the intermediates. Homestead included, I think, is a track that will play to William Byron's, obviously, what's been the strength of that team this year. So I like all four of those picks, but of course, William Byron as the best value out of our favorites category. Looking at some sleepers, though, here, Cole, these are drivers that have a little bit more of an outside chance of winning the race, but maybe are somewhere between the 6th through 10th drivers in 6th through 15th in terms of the odds by Vegas. And I'm going to start with the guy who's named after this race, who this race is named after. That's Kevin Harvick, the Forever 400, and he's going to be racing a throwback paint scheme to his 2014 championship with Budweiser on the hood this week. So why not Kevin Harvick? Well, here's the case for him. Plus 3,000 for the win, 8,100 in daily fantasy, which is a very solid price for a guy that's been right around a top 15 car at mile-and-a-half tracks this year. 15th place average finish. Overall, his average this season in 2023, but his last top 10 came on the last mile-and-a-half track prior to Vegas, which was Texas. And he was elite at Homestead over the course of his lengthy career, including the win, which came, of course, at this track when he won the championship in 2014. 22 Homestead starts. He has placed top 10 in all but 3 of those. That is 19 out of 22 starts at this track. He has placed top 10. That'll give him a 7.3 average finish. That is the best in the field, despite all of the starts he has made here. Over 400 laps led, and he finished 8th at this track last year. So for Kevin Harvick, again, running out of time for that final full-time Cup Series win. He's got 3 more shots at it. This is a really good chance. I think you look at Phoenix as obviously the best track in his entire career, but you're going to have drivers that are competing for a championship that day. So looking at that as a race that's probably going to be won by one of the championship 4. Number 4, Kevin Harvick will not be part of that company. So I think that this realistically is his best chance to win out of the 3 remaining races. And again, you go into all the pageantry of the race being named after him, a track with a lot of nostalgia with the championship win there in 2014. Plus 3,000 is a very solid value for a guy that's going to have a solid chance to win this race and potentially win his final Cup Series race at a track that he's got lots of memories at. Another guy that's got some memories here because he's a former champion is another sleeper of mine. That's Brad Keselowski, who finished 4th at Vegas last week and has had modest success at Homestead in his career, a 13.6 average finish. Top 10s in nearly half of his 15 starts. He has finished 3rd there twice, including 5th last year, top 10s in both stages, 2022 in the next-gen car. That was when we really started to see signs that this RFK team would be one to be reckoned with in 2023, and that proved to be no fluke. Low risk because of the moderate success he's had this year, but obviously a high reward. You look at a driver that came very close to winning last week's race at Vegas, really good value at 8,300 in daily fantasy, and plus 2,000 for a race winner pick. Again, if you're looking at drivers that could place spoiler this week, I'm looking at those 2 former champions, Brad K and Kevin Harvick. I'll be honest, I think the winner is going to be one of the drivers that's remaining in the playoffs, but if it's not, I really think it's going to be one of these 2 drivers.
Yeah, I like both those drivers a lot. I think they're both exceptional values as well in that $8,300 and $8,100 range. I would call both those either a lock or a borderline lock in Kevin Harvick's case. But 2 drivers I want to touch on are also former champions. And if you notice the theme here, it's that this entire sleepers category is composed of former champions. And that is because this used to be the finale, obviously, for a very long time in the Cup Series. But it takes also a certain kind of excellence and skill set to really excel at this tricky track. So I think that's why you're going to see that in these 2 drivers I'm going to mention as well. The first being Martin Truex Jr. And yes, I am calling him a sleeper, even though he is plus 600 for the win and $10,000 for DFS. Why? You mentioned it. He scored his first top 10 and laps led in the playoffs at Vegas this past week, bringing his total average in the playoffs through those 7 races to 19.8. So he's been struggling a lot. The whole team's been struggling at that. So that's why I'm going to call him a sleeper for this win. But at Homestead, he obviously has the win here back in his championship year in 2017. 9.7 average, which is the second best overall with only 2 DNFs in 18 starts. So, he had some of those down years with MWR and DEI. So to have that average finish, I think that speaks volumes. Only 2 DNFs in that time as well is also really telling. And that's why I think he's someone that's worth looking at for sure. But also, he finished 6th in this race last year, top 3 in both stages, so you know he's going to be fast. And I think the bottom line is here, it's crunch time. He's only +2 above the cutoff going into this race. He's the regular season champion, and I think at this point, obviously he wasn't hanging back those first 6-7 races, but you had enough of a cushion to where you can get those mistakes out of the way. And I think now you're going to see James Small, Truex, and that 19 team pulled all together, have a really, really strong performance. I'm not going to say a race-winning performance, but I think you're going to see this team run inside that top 5 and maybe challenge for that win. It'll be tough to get past the likes of Kyle Larson and Tyler Reddick, though, I think. But honestly, I'm going to say this right now. I'm not particularly high on either of those values, +600 for the win, 10,000 for DFS, and I wouldn't really entertain either personally unless you felt very strongly about him. But I think I would not be surprised if he challenged for this win. That is why he's a sleeper in my opinion. For my final driver in this category, I'm going to go with Kyle Busch, valued at +2,000 for the win and $9,700 for DFS. I will keep this short and sweet. Kyle Busch is looking like the KFB of old to close out the season, and we see this time and time again every single year. No matter how he's doing, where he's at, when it comes down to the playoffs, whether he's in it or not, he will perform, and I think you're seeing that once again, riding back-to-back third-place finishes off the Charlotte Roval and now Las Vegas, which marked his 10th top 5 of the season. So Kyle Busch looking really strong lately. Also, in reference to Homestead, riding a 8-race top 10 streak there that began with his championship win back in 2015. 4.9 average finish over those last 8 Miami starts, with 2 wins and his last coming in 2019 and one runner-up wedged in there as well. So I think, to put it simply, Kyle Busch is a very underrated pick this week. I think both his values are very much worth looking at. It'll be tough to squeeze in him for DFS because if you want to fit in the likes of a Kyle Larson or Denny Hamlin, you got to go smaller, which will show some drivers here in the value picks category. But if you're looking for consistency, I think Kyle Busch will be a lock for your lineups. I think he is going to be someone to look at for your top 5 prop bets. And even, I'm not sure how the top 10 props look like because they're not up yet on BetMGM, but he finished 9th here last year. I think Kyle Busch is a very under-the-radar pick. And you mentioned guys like Kevin Harvick and Brad Keselowski as potential sleepers for the win. I think Kyle Busch, he's kind of that guy right now in my head where it's like a good gut call as someone who I think can be a legitimate contender for this win.
I know we're going to get to our value picks now, but I really like the value that lies in those sleepers. Obviously, the exception to that is Truex, because at +600 and 10,000 in DFS, it's not a value at all. But certainly based on the numbers, you illustrated why he would be a value. But, you know, as far as sleepers for the win, sleepers for top 5s, Kyle Busch, Kevin Harvick, Brad Keselowski, all +2,000 odds or longer. I really like the value that lies in our sleepers this week, with the exception of Truex. But our actual value picks, we're going to go with guys that are pretty well priced in daily fantasy in terms of ones that we would probably use in our lineups. I'm going to start with Austin Dillon, who is the cheapest value of any of these drivers in the tier. $6,400 is his DFS price this week. Finished a career best 4th at Homestead last year and has an 11.6 average finish in 9 starts at Homestead, which ranks 6th in the sport, lowest finish of 25th at this track. And he's had an erratic season, which is obviously the cause for concern, something to think about if you do pick him. The caveat to that, of course, is that he has been consistent at Homestead over the course of his career. So it just seems like, again, value picks. This is the tier we're going with. Austin Dillon's a very solid value this week. Another guy I really like at 16th highest odds for the win, the rookie Ty Gibbs at 7,800 in daily fantasy. Listen, we've said it all year. He's had such an impressive rookie season that at some point this year, he's going to come away with a win. It hasn't happened, but there's 3 weeks left for it. Why not this week for Ty Gibbs, who had top 10 speed the last 2 weeks? He's finished 33rd or worse, or top 5 in his last 5 starts. So he's been extremely hit or miss over the last 5 weeks. Finished 22nd at Homestead last year and 2nd place in the Xfinity Series in 2022 at Homestead. So I think you look at Ty Gibbs as a guy that has been really strong all year. Again, has had a volatile last 5 starts, but top 10 speed the last 2 weeks, and I like the idea of him ending the season on a strong note. This is kind of the stretch of races, the final, I'll say 3 or 4 races of the season, where you start to see teams make a statement for next season, the season to upcoming. And that's, like I mentioned before with Brad Keselowski, we started seeing signs at the end of the season that RFK would be a force in 2023. I think you're going to start to see some of those teams try to make a statement this week that could be contenders in 2024. And I think that Ty Gibbs at 7,400 in daily fantasy, rather 7,800 in daily fantasy, is a very solid value. And he is, out of our DFS value picks this week, he is the most expensive of those, but nonetheless, at 7,800 is a value.
For sure. I mean, you're paying for the great equipment and for a driver that's been a top 10, maybe even a top 5 car the past couple weeks. But I like both those guys a lot. For me, I want to start off with our winner from the Charlotte Roval 2 weeks ago, the Dinger, AJ Allmendinger, valued at $7,000. He finished a career-best third at this track last year. Also has 4 top 10s in total in 11 Cup starts at this track with a respectable 16.5 average. That's with running a lot of these races for JTG Daugherty when they were not at their best. So I think that's a really good value right here for someone who finished third in this race last year and has some respectable success throughout his entire Cup career at this track. Also finished third at Homestead last year in the Xfinity Series with nearly 50 laps led between 3 of 4 starts there. So I would say for AJ, this is a track he's gotten around very well as far as an oval, even when he wasn't at his best in the Cup Series or in his NASCAR career. So I think AJ is a really, really sneaky good pick, especially coming off that solid run at Vegas, obviously the win at the Charlotte Roval. A lot of good buzz on his side going into this race. And then finally, I will end things with Ricky Stenhouse Jr., valued at $6,700, and who I think is the best value on this episode personally in this category. No top 10s in 11 starts at Homestead, but been consistent enough in my opinion. Top 15 in his last 2 starts at Homestead, which includes a career-best 13th in 2021. On top of that, he's riding a 6-race top 20 streak here with a 16.3 average in that time, similar to his 16.7 average on 1.5-mile tracks in 2023, with 2 top 10s wedged in there as well. So for Ricky, I would say that he is a reliable driver with a great value, and also one of those drivers with a dirt racing background, which we know helps at this track, running that high line right against the wall. So again, I like all the drivers in this category, but for me, I think Ricky's got to be the most cost-efficient value for this episode.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of all 4 of those drivers for the reasons we named. Those are very solid values. Let's get this down to 6 drivers, Cole. We just named 12 total, 4 in each tier. We named 2 per person per tier. Let's each pick 1 per tier. I'm going to take Kyle Larson as my favorite of the week. I'll take Kevin Harvick as my favorite sleeper of the week, and I'll go with Austin Dillon, cheapest driver in the value picks category, as my favorite value of the week.
Sweet. For me, I will go with the other Hendrick car as my favorite for the week, William Byron. My sleeper is going to be Kyle Busch, and then for my value pick, I really like Ricky Stenhouse Jr.
Let's talk big money bets here, Cole. These are bets that, if you're new to the show, they're prop bets, top 5s, top 10s, some head-to-head matchups, which we'll get to in a minute. Could be manufacturer bets. You alluded to it before. There's no top 10s listed currently on BetMGM. They may be on DraftKings, which we can take a look at and possibly get back to you on social media if they are there. But we're going to take a look at the top 5 bets as far as our big money bets this week. What's sticking out to you?
Yeah, for me, I'm not seeing a whole ton of great values this week for Homestead. I'm looking at 4 drivers specifically, and the first 2 I'm going to mention have the same odds to finish top 5. That would be Denny Hamlin and William Byron at plus 110. And the other 2 I'm going to mention are former champions in Brad Keselowski and Kyle Busch, valued at plus 250 to finish top 5. I think you can go either way with any of those 4 drivers. Picking one over the other for each of those odds would be my best advice as far as strategy. If you feel better about one over the other, for me, they would probably be William Byron and Kyle Busch. But I think those are the only 4 real values I'm seeing right now going into this race weekend before practice and qualifying.
Yeah, I'm going to make this pretty easy this week, Cole. I'm going to completely agree with you. I have and we'll get into this in a second because we're going to talk about the match bets, that are parlayable. I really have a good feeling that our top 10 is going to look like a lot of the playoff drivers and those two guys you mentioned, Brad Keselowski, Kyle Busch. I like the idea of Hamlin, Byron, Brad K, Kyle Busch to be in the top 5. Really, any of the drivers we mentioned in this episode, I kind of like the idea of top 5 bets, but I think they're going to be kind of interchangeable. And that's a good segue into these parlayable bets because these are ones that are head-to-head driver matchups that you can parlay with one another. And this is 4 playoff drivers stacked head-to-head, and then Austin Dillon versus Chase Elliott, which kind of gives you an idea that Vegas is thinking that Austin Dillon and Chase Elliott are similar tiered drivers this week, and that is further proof, in my opinion, that Austin Dillon's a really good value pick because they're stacking him with Chase Elliott. But then you've got the other 4 matchups. It's kind of, if you had to pair the 4 drivers, you've got the 2 young guys that are a little bit more underestimated, and Tyler Reddick versus Christopher Bell. You got the 2 Hendrick Chevys, Kyle Larson versus William Byron. The 2 Joe Gibbs Toyotas, Denny Hamlin versus Martin Truex. And then you've got the 2 drivers that are 7th and 8th in the standings, most on the outside looking in Christopher Buescher versus Ryan Blaney. So it's 4 very similar playoff drivers head-to-head with one another. Again, I alluded to the fact that I really think that our top 10 is going to be comprised of bare minimum 6 of those 8 playoff drivers, in my opinion. So for that reason, I'm going to stay away from the match bets this week. I don't know if there's any of those that jump off the page to you. I mean, I know we talked a lot about the 2 Hendrick drivers, a couple of the Gibbs drivers. I think, obviously, Austin Dillon's a guy that we like this week, but do we like him enough to place that bet over Chase Elliott? That's another question in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a tough call. For me, I think there are a few clear winners in these matchups. I think, obviously, it's a bit of a toss-up between Kyle Larson and William Byron, but you look at what Kyle Larson did last week, what he did last year at Homestead, and just how he runs this track historically, you got to pick him over William Byron. I think Tyler Reddick outperforms Christopher Bell on any given Sunday at Homestead. That team is just so good at this track and ripping that high line like Kyle Larson. I think the Elliott and Dillon one is, I mean, on paper, it looks like it should go in Elliott's favor, but for the reasons we discussed in our episode, you could make a case for Austin Dillon. However, Chase Elliott definitely is winning this battle. Better equipment. Didn't include him on the episode. However, he has a 9.7 average in 9 starts, which is tied for second best with Martin Truex Jr. I know it's a smaller sample size, but still, I mean, it's still pretty damn good for 9 starts. And then obviously, I like Denny Hamlin over Martin Truex Jr., just seeing as where these teams are at right now at this point in the season. I think Denny Hamlin is the much better driver, and that is a much more complete team. So if you add those drivers together, Kyle Larson, Tyler Reddick, Chase Elliott, Denny Hamlin, you have a odds payout of plus 591. Throw $10 on that, and your payout is $69.14. So I think there definitely is value here. If you didn't feel as comfortable maybe picking between Denny Hamlin and Martin Truex Jr., Kyle Larson, and William Byron, then you could do like the 3 matchups, and you still have a pretty decent payout. But in my opinion, I think your best value is going to be probably in the top 5, top 3, top 10 big money prop bets as opposed to the match bets as well.
It's a good perspective that differs obviously from what I had to say, so it's always nice when we have differing opinions there. Let's talk daily fantasy here because we've given some really good values. Let's look at our lineup recommendation for this week, which is also, again, past couple weeks we've put out some really good DFS lineups. I like the idea, and you obviously agree with me here, Cole, of leading off the lineup with the driver that is the most sure thing. That is undoubtedly Kyle Larson, who is very, very steeply priced at $11,500, but we both agreed several times this episode that he is worth the price of admission, $11,500. That makes you have to do some creative things with the rest of your lineup, but we've had some really good values that we've discussed over this episode. So our second most expensive driver is actually Brad Keselowski at $8,300. Right behind Tim, Kevin Harvick at $8,100. So a couple guys that were both in our sleepers tier. And then 3 of our value picks of the week round out this lineup. And Ty Gibbs at $7,800, AJ Allmendinger at $7,000, and Ricky Stenhouse Jr. at $6,700. So those are 6 drivers we harped on quite a bit. We talked about our favorite of the week, which is Kyle Larson. 2 of our favorite sleepers, Harvick and Keselowski, and then 3 of our favorite value picks in those last 3 drivers that I mentioned. So this is, from that perspective, an extremely balanced fantasy lineup recommendation.
Yeah, truthfully, I love this lineup. I think there's not a lot of holes in it and not a lot of drivers that are going to sink you completely. And obviously having Kyle Larson in there, who we think is going to go out there, lead every lap, dominate this thing, and just put on an absolute clinic, I think is always going to be beneficial to your points day in DFS. So I'm a huge fan of it. I think it's very consistent, very well-rounded. And this was an interesting week because going in, for me anyway, I thought it was going to be very difficult to fit Kyle Larson or Denny Hamlin in your lineup just because they were so heavily favored. I mean, $11,500, $11,000, that's really, really steep to include one of these guys and have a really solid lineup. But I went ahead and the first lineup I did, I went basically from the back up, and I put in some anchors in AJ Allmendinger and Stenhouse, who I think are going to be really solid drivers for this race. Two drivers who we talked about at length and how they've been consistent enough to merit some value for this week in DFS. And then building up, I got to where William Byron was my ace in the hole, and you had Kyle Busch in there over Kevin Harvick, which I think obviously will give you some more power and a better shot at the win as opposed to Kevin Harvick. And I was happy with this lineup, but truthfully, if I wasn't going to include Kyle Larson, it just didn't feel like it was going to be a winning lineup to me. So I went the alternate route, and I started with my ace in the hole and Kyle Larson for this lineup and worked my way down, and it ended up being what I think is an even better lineup consistently. So big fan of our lineup this week. I think we discussed all of these drivers at great length in our episode, and that's always a good sign of a really solidly curated lineup. I feel, again, really good about it.
Well, let's take it to the bank here, Cole, because as you mentioned, we've discussed several drivers at length this episode. Let's put our money where our mouth is and talk some race winner picks and our favorite sleepers of the week. This is, again, if you're new to the show by some chance in race number 34 of the season, we like to give, it might be a gut check for the win or a gut check for our sleeper pick, but we take turns every week. And for some context, 4 consecutive weeks, we have picked a driver, one of us has picked a driver that's finished top 2, and we have picked 3 of the last 4 winners. So listen up here. Cole's going to pick first. You had the winner last week in choosing Kyle Larson. I had first pick, and I took William Byron, who was obviously no slouch, but he was no Kyle Larson. But as such, you do have the first pick this week. What do you got?
Yes, let's go. Yeah, I would be an idiot not to pick Kyle Larson this week. Just looking at what he did last week, what he did last season here, and just how he runs historically is no joke. And even like his post-race press conference at Vegas, he said he wants to win both stages by 15 seconds and win the race by 30. So I think he doesn't have anything to worry about. All he's got to do is go out there and get the win, and I think he will definitely get that done on Sunday.
Yeah, that's a no-brainer pick to me. That kind of confidence is rare to hear, especially from a guy that's contending for a championship like Kyle Larson. That's almost bordering on cockiness than confidence. But I love Larson this week. I mentioned it near the beginning of the episode. I really think that the drivers that have been top tier all season long, one of them is going to win, whether it's Larson. The other 2 I really have in consideration this week are William Byron and Denny Hamlin. I think this week it's going to be Denny Hamlin. I just have a really good feeling about him. Again, Homestead, a track that he has historically been really, really good at. Obviously, again, one of the top drivers all throughout the playoffs as well. I love Denny this week. I think he punches his ticket into the championship 4 and then can go into Martinsville next week and not have to worry too much about advancing. And it'll be Larson, it'll be Denny, and then we'll have to see who else gets in. But I feel good about Denny this week. And I'm going for a gut check with my sleeper pick. I'm thinking about the fact that, we discussed the Cup Series on this podcast at length, but it's also crunch time for the other national touring series. It's crunch time for the Truck Series. It's crunch time for the Xfinity Series. And I want to pick a driver we haven't touched on at all this episode. That's John Hunter Nemechek, and he's going for a championship in the Xfinity Series. We talk about drivers that are peaking at the right time in the Cup Series. Kyle Larson, Denny Hamlin, William Byron, those teams that have really put things together and are peaking at the right time. Well, JHN has put together a phenomenal Xfinity Series season, and I just think that the confidence, we just talked about riding high for a guy like Larson that's a championship front runner. The confidence is riding high for John Hunter Nemechek. Again, he wants to prove that he's worthy of a Cup ride full-time next year after, again, a phenomenal Xfinity Series season. And I think you go to a track in Homestead that's very storied, and I just like the idea of a John Hunter Nemechek gut call this week.
Yeah, it'll be a nice early debut at Legacy for John Hunter Nemechek. I'm very intrigued to see how he does in that equipment. Will be exciting nonetheless. For me, I'm going to go with my value pick for my 3 drivers I narrowed it down to in Stenhouse. I just like what I've seen from this driver the entire season. I like what I've seen from him as far as his Homestead resume over the past 6 races, all top 20s in that span, riding back-to-back top 15s there. I think he'll be in due for a really good run, a borderline top 10 day, and I think he's going to be one of the MVPs for DFS this weekend as well. So in me picking Larson and you picking Denny Hamlin, I think we're on the same page here in thinking that the winner is either going to be Kyle Larson, William Byron, or Denny Hamlin. And I think the important thing to note here is that we have either won or picked the runner-up driver for these last 4 races. So what we're saying here is definitely worth taking into consideration. I think if you've listened to us and watched our episodes and you've followed our advice, you've probably cashed out handsomely these past 4 weeks specifically. So if we're saying it's going to be Kyle Larson, Denny Hamlin, William Byron, it will likely be one of those guys. And I think it would be wise to put, at least some sort of money on one or all 3 of those drivers in a way that won't break your bank, obviously, if by chance they do not end up in victory lane. But point of the story here is that we've been really damn good in picking these race winners.
Yeah, and listen, the deeper we get into the season, the more data we have to go off of. That's quite simply why things have gone so well for us during these playoffs, and it's just kind of like we've aged like a fine wine this year. With every race, we have more to go off of. We have more stats. We have more to back us up. And again, this is all taken into consideration too. We're going off of what we've seen prior to the cars even hitting the track. So that's always something to keep in consideration that I always like to point out. But I really feel that here, as we go to our last mile and a half track of the season, that this is going to be a very matter-of-fact sort of race. I think that your top 10 is going to look very much like Vegas is forecasting. I think that, as you mentioned, Cole, with the drop-off for sleepers, I feel like once you get past that tier of drivers that's at plus 2,000, after the Kyle Busches, Brad Keselowski's, the Ryan Blaney's of the world, I feel like there's a pretty immense drop-off when you get to that tier of drivers like Bubba Wallace, Joey Logano, and Ty Gibbs. I feel like out of those top 13 or so drivers that Vegas is forecasting to be the top drivers in terms of going for the win this week, I feel like that's what we're going to see in the top 10. So this is the Forever 400, named after Kevin Harvick, of course, going to Homestead for the final time in his full-time Cup Series career. 235 green flag at Homestead, one of my favorite tracks on the circuit personally. This upcoming Sunday, really fun race. It's time to drop the jack here on the most important NASCAR betting stop of the day. Hope you're trailing us. Hope you're riding with us, as there's only 3 more weeks to continue collecting your bankroll here on the Money Stop. We're Drop the Jack. He's Cole Cusumano. I'm Steven, and we'll see you next week.